Hello and welcome to Science Ridge Church. This is Pastor Jacob. I wanted to say here on the front end, if you are enjoying any of these messages or you want to stay connected or learn more about our church, you can visit our website, scienceridgechurch.org. You can also check out our Facebook page where we have information about upcoming events and just general church happenings there as well. Today we are talking about one of the more well-known characters of the Bible, and that is King David. King David has a very varied life where he follows God really well sometimes, and other times he certainly makes some mistakes. But he keeps coming back to God, keeps repenting whenever his faults are pointed out to him. Today we are talking about one specific story where God makes a promise to David. And this promise that God makes to David is something that will reverberate or will be carried on or remembered by the people for hundreds and hundreds of years. We'll continue to hear about this for many more messages as the people have expectations around this promise. So let's tune in today and learn a little bit about this promise that God makes to King David. So today we are talking about King David. And David's kind of an interesting guy. His story takes place in the books of 1st and 2nd Samuel. And originally in Hebrew, those were all one book, and then when they translated it to Greek, they split it into two because it couldn't all fit onto one scroll. But you can read about his story. We know that he starts as a shepherd boy. He is the youngest of the family, and he has the whole fight with David and Goliath. He rises to prominence. He clashes with King Saul, and ultimately he becomes king himself. We know that many of the Psalms are written by David, and he is considered someone who has a heart for God. But David is also very human. Especially as he gets older and as David amasses more power, we read about that he commits adultery, he plots murder. 2 Samuel 5, how he notes how he took several wives and concubines. He turns a blind eye when his daughter is raped. He's kicked out during rebellion. And then towards the end of his life, he goes on a little bit of a murderous purge of all of his enemies and adversaries. So David is not a perfect person either, not a perfect leader. And today we are going to look at just one key story of one key event in David's life, and this takes place a little earlier in King David's rule as king. This story is actually one that impacts the entire rest of the Bible. And it even follows through and connects, we'll see, to our lives today. And we're going to see in this story how God takes and makes a particular promise to David and how that promise is kept over time. So that led me to the question, how good are you at keeping your promises? It seems like there are some people who pride themselves on always being people who keep their word no matter what, and then there are others who just say what they need to say in order to get what they want or need in that moment. Now, most of us think that we are people of our word, we like to say. Jesus talks about this on the Sermon on the Mount. He says, let your yes be no, your yes be yes, your no be no. Your yes be yes, your yes be no, no. Your yes, yes, and your no, no. Be people of your word. Be honest, and if you're going to say you're going to do something, then do it. We have a landlord that whenever I have a conversation with him, he always ends the conversation by saying, be safe. And I always say, I'll try. And one day he kind of got after him. He said, why don't you just say, yes, I will be safe? And I said, well, I can't promise that I'm always going to make a safe choice. You know, there might be a situation where I need to climb onto something, where I might have to balance to reach. I might trip on my shoelaces. I can't promise that I will be safe, but I can promise that I will try to be safe. I want to keep my word. I want to have a little bit of that reputation. So how long have you kept a promise? Maybe some of you might have some memory that you promised your parents. I'm making these up. I don't know if anyone has ever done this. Maybe when you were little, you promised your parents you would fold the laundry. And to this day, 50 years later, you are still folding the laundry. I did not make that promise, and I do not fold my laundry. Maybe you promised that you would always, feed the dog, and that has become a promise that you have kept. Sometimes we make these promises younger in life, and we build it as a habit into our lives, and we keep that promise for a long, long time. And sometimes God makes promises. And God will keep a promise for a long, long time. And today we see a specific promise that God makes to David. And it's not only a personal promise to David, but a promise that impacts the timeline of human history and human expectation. And God kept this promise. So let's start by looking at our scripture. We're in 2 Samuel chapter 7. I'm going to just read from the first 17 verses here. Just a little bit of the background. Last week we talked about the rise of the kingdom of Israel. So we talked about how God had originally instructed them to live without a king. God was going to try to reach the world with this message of salvation, and it makes sense that God would not do this by just locking the people into a kingdom, but that God would be their king, and anyone can join. Because, once you have a king and once you have a kingdom, then you have citizens and you have people that are in and people that are out. And when you have a king and a kingdom, people lift up that king as a ruler. And when they have problems, they go to the king for answers rather than going to God for answers and guidance. And we also see when we get to the story of David, earlier in the Judges, the people sing praises to God for rescuing them from their enemies. And then David comes along, and we read that people begin to sing praises to David. They sing praises to the king for rescuing them from their enemies. So all of these problems come about when you raise up a king or a ruler and have a nation. But the people wanted a king, so God allowed them to have a king. Saul was chosen as a king, and Saul had some issues. God chooses David, and David becomes king. Right before this story, David spends some time as king securing the area, making sure he is taking care of some of the enemies. He conquers Jerusalem. He brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem and sets it up. The Ark of the Covenant is still in a tent, in a tabernacle at this point. And we get to 2 Samuel 7. So that's all background, and here we are. We see that after the king, this is after King David, was settled in his palace, and the Lord had given him rest from all of his enemies around him, he said to Nathan the prophet, "Here I am, living in a palace of cedar, while the ark of God remains in a tent." And Nathan replied to the king, "Whatever you have in mind, go ahead and do it, for the Lord is with you." And that night the word of the Lord came to Nathan, saying, "Go and tell my servant David, this is what the Lord says. Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in? I have not dwelt in a house from the day I brought the Israelites up out of Egypt to this day. I have been moving from place to place with a tent as my dwelling. Wherever I have moved with all of the Israelites, did I ever say to any of their rulers whom I commanded to shepherd my people Israel, 'Why have you not built me a house of cedar?' Now then, tell my servant David, this is what the Lord Almighty says. I took you from the pasture from following the flock to be a ruler over my people Israel. I have been with you wherever you have gone, and I have cut off all your enemies from before you. Now I will make your name great, like the names of the greatest men of earth, and I will provide a place for my people Israel and will plant them so that they can have a home of their own and no longer be disturbed. Wicked people will not oppress them anymore as they did from the beginning, and have done ever since the time I appointed leaders over my people. I will also give you rest from your enemies. The Lord declares to you that the Lord himself will establish a house for you. When your days are over and you rest with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, who will come from your own body, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. When he does wrong, I will punish him with the rod of men, with floggings inflicted by men. But my love will never be taken away from him, as I took it away from Saul, whom I removed before you. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever." And Nathan reported to David all the words of this entire revelation. And then the rest of this chapter, I encourage you to read it. David expresses his gratitude to God, and it's almost like a psalm in itself there, the rest of that chapter. As we look at these verses here that I read, these first 17 verses, I'm going to talk about three movements that we see. The first movement that we see is that David finds rest. David finds rest. David has been active for most of his life up to this point. He has been tending the sheep. He has been going out to war. He has been running from Saul. He has been leading. He is a man of action. And some of you might be able to relate to this. Some people just have a hard time sitting still. Right? We need a project to do. We need to keep our minds occupied. We like to be solving problems. We like to be doing something. And David is one of those people. He has been doing, he has been acting, he has been working on things. But here it says, David rests. David has been settled. Resting and being still is an important part of our growth. Reflection, taking time to kind of look back over how we got to where we are, any problems that might be going on. These things happen when we are not doing something. We need time to look back over our actions, our circumstances, our past, to be able to vision to the future. Rest is important for those moments. And I firmly believe that personal growth cannot happen when you are doing something, when your mind is occupied with other things. Personal growth happens in rest, in the silence, in the waiting. Now that might be as simple as sitting down with a cup of tea or hot chocolate or coffee with your phone out of the way and just sitting and doing nothing, allowing your mind to just not be encumbered by other distractions. It might be going for a walk without headphones. It might be driving in the car without having the radio on, particularly if you are stuck at a red light or stuck in traffic, just sitting there, resting, not having anything else to do. That might be standing and looking out the window. It might be sitting outside. It might be, especially this time of year, sitting around a fire or at a fireplace, just sitting there with no other agenda. That is rest. And in those moments, we begin to reflect, evaluate, think of what is going on in our lives, what might be working, what might not be working. And this story starts with David resting. It gives him a chance, after he's done all of these things, he's been so busy, it gives him a chance to pause, to think, and to look around. And as David looks around, he notices that he has this nice house. Earlier in chapter 5, the king of Tyre sent him all the materials to build this palace. And he has built a palace for himself there in Jerusalem. And suddenly he gets to chapter 7 and he rests and he looks around and he realizes that he has this nice place to live, but the ark of God is still housed in the tabernacle. It's still in the tent. Now the tabernacle was something that God had directed the people to build, and it symbolized that God would be with them wherever they went. So as the people moved, God would move with them. God was not bound to a single place. God is mobile. But here is David in luxury while God was in the tent. And David, I think I woke him up. David didn't look at his palace and say, maybe I should downgrade. Maybe this palace is too big for me, too opulent. Maybe I should think about something more along what God is in. No, instead, David said, maybe I should give God an upgrade so that God can match my lifestyle. And we could speculate about why David maybe does this. Maybe David was bored. He was resting and he wanted another project to do. And so he thought, this is another project I can tackle. Maybe David is looking around and he is maybe guilty about this wealth that he has. And he has all this display of power, but God has this tent, and maybe there's some guilt going on there. Maybe David's heart is for God. He wants to honor God and give God glory by making a nice palace for God. Maybe David wants to try to earn God's favor. We don't see specifically why David wants to do it. We can speculate on these things. But David has this vision. And so David talks to Nathan the prophet. And he says, hey, Prophet Nathan, I got this thing I want to do. And Nathan's like, hey, God is with you wherever you go. Go for it. That sounds great. And this verse and this passage is why it's important for you all to practice discernment in your own lives. Because you should not always rely on what I or what other leaders say, because something might be off with it, or sometimes we might get it wrong. So Nathan says, yeah, that sounds great, go and do it. And then the text says, that night, immediately, God spoke to Nathan and said, no, don't do that. Don't build that house. So you have to use discernment in your own lives when leaders say something, because sometimes we don't always get it right. But the text says, that night, God spoke to Nathan, and while David is dreaming about building this palace, Nathan is having this dream with God, stopping David's plans. And sometimes we make plans, sometimes we have different ideas, and God stops them. God sometimes closes doors in our life. And I pray that all of my bad ideas, God stops as quickly as what he did with Nathan, that it was that immediate. In Proverbs 16:9, it says, in the hearts humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. In their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord is the one that establishes their steps. So David was planning his course, but the Lord had different steps for him to take. And God directs Nathan to go back and confront David with this little speech that we read. And that's where we get to the second movement here. This second movement, where God responds to David's idea about building God a house. And this section almost reminds me of Job 38. I encourage you at some point to go read Job 38, or you can pull up the song. There's a song by a band called Ghost Ship called Where Were You? And in Job 38, Job is kind of complaining to God about why am I in this bad situation? And God says, where were you when I created the world? Where were you when I filled the heavens with thunder and hailstones? Who are you to question me? Anyway, this makes me think of that in Job 38. And God makes two arguments here to David in 2 Samuel. He first makes this argument that God has lived in a tent and it's been fine. The people have not been settled, so why should God be settled in a house? You know, that's another problem with the people wanting to create a kingdom rather than having this tribal confederacy that they had before. When you have a tribal, kind of a non-centralized thing, your geography can be a little fluid. But as soon as you have a kingdom, then you have boundaries around your people. It becomes a set geography. And God, as the people build up this temple eventually, God becomes tied closely to one specific geographical area rather than being God over the whole world. And God says to David that it was God who made David great. God doesn't need David to amplify his glory. So the first argument is that God has lived in a tent and it's been fine. Why should that change now? And then the second argument is that God is the one who made David great. David doesn't need to make God great. God's greatness and glory is not dependent on David's wealth. It's not dependent on David's ability or his vision or his dreams. And on the flip side of that, David's significance, his self-worth is not based, or it should not be based, on his accomplishments. David's significance is not based on what he has done for God, but it's based on his service to God. Sometimes we can be kind of hard on ourselves when we think that we are not doing enough for God. We might look and we might see other people who are missionaries, or they're volunteering, or they're leaders, or they're involved in some way, and we might think to ourselves, I'm not doing enough for God. Or we might wake up one day like David and we see a life that we have built for ourselves, and we realize that we haven't really done much work in the things of God, or helping God, or helping the church. Now, it is good to volunteer. It is good to lead, to give time, to help out. But you cannot earn favor from God by doing things for God. God's love for you does not increase if you decide to be the worship host for a month, or to be a door greeter, or to volunteer someplace, or to help out. And in a similar way, David's significance doesn't come from what he does. David's significance comes from him being open to being used by God, his desire to serve God. Think back to the story of David and Goliath. When David is there in front of Goliath, his significance doesn't come because he has really good skills with a slingshot and he can take out. It's not his abilities that make that story significant. It's his desire to be used by God to conquer Goliath. Okay, you see the difference here? One way of saying is, this is what I will do for you, God. The other one says, God, what can I do? And it's that second attitude, God, what can I do, that is being encouraged, or that God wants to redirect David to. One tries to earn, the other tries to serve. And God kind of goes on and says here that, David, I am above and beyond anything that you can do or imagine. It was God who took David from being a shepherd to the king. And David's standing before God is not based on what he gets done, because everything that David has accomplished has been empowered by God as it is. And David's accomplishments came about because of his heart and his desire to serve God. So God confronts David with this message that God does the building, it's not David. God is free and independent. God can't be contained. But God doesn't stop at this lecture. God flips things around at the end. And we get to the third movement here in these verses, where God makes a promise to David. There's actually two promises here, or a couple different ways of looking at this promise. The first promise is that David is not allowed to build God a house, but God is going to establish David's house. God is going to establish David's dynasty forever, it says. Remember, this is early in the time of the kings. This is still something new for the people. And God makes a covenant with David that his rule, that this kingdom that David has built is going to live on. And that is a big deal. Up until this point, there has been no successive dynasty. There's been a few judges way back in the story of Judges that tried to set it up so that their kids, their children would follow along in leadership, but that never lasted. Saul didn't last. Jonathan didn't take over from Saul. But here, David is assured by God that his dynasty will last. This is ultimately a continuation. It's a reiteration of the promise that Adam and Eve received, that Abraham received, that Moses received. God is going to stay with these people. God is going to work through them to bring a blessing to the world. They might not always make the right choices, but God will work with them to see the mission of bringing salvation to the world, the mission of reconnecting people to God, accomplished. And so what happens? As we go forward in history, we get to the New Testament. We read Matthew and Luke, and they both begin with genealogies, right? These genealogies that connect Jesus back to David. And if you happen to look at it, I'll just point it out, Matthew and Luke have different genealogies, and some think that one is the genealogy of Joseph and the other is the genealogy of Mary. But the connection in both of them is made back to David. Jesus is the king who sits on the throne of David, and Jesus will reign as king forever and ever. This passage here in 2 Samuel points to Jesus' true identity. Jesus inherits this promise that is made to David. Jesus is the true ruler of the people. He is the king of the true kingdom of God. And this was a promise made 1,000 years before Jesus. 1,000 years before Jesus, God makes this promise. So how long have you kept a promise? Ephesians 1 says that Jesus is seated at the place of honor at God's right hand. In verse 21 and 22, it says that Jesus, he is far above any ruler or authority or power or leader or anything else, not only in this world, but also in the world to come. God has put all things under the authority of Christ. There is no king above King Jesus, no ruler, no leader who stands above the power that Jesus has. And the promise made to David is realized initially for many generations of kings in Jerusalem, but it is realized completely in Jesus, who is our king. So that's kind of the first promise that happens here. But then there's a second promise. And that second promise is that one of David's sons will build God a house, build God a home, a temple. When David gets older, he begins to make plans for Solomon to build a temple. And we read about this in 1 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles 22, he begins to gather supplies, he readies the labor, he gets the gold and the nails together. And David has this comment that he makes to his son Solomon, because he knows Solomon is going to be the one to build the temple. And David says in 1 Chronicles 22, he says, "My son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God. But this word of the Lord came to me. You have shed too much blood and have fought many wars. You are not to build a house for my name, because you have shed much blood on earth in my sight." And David goes on to give instructions for Solomon to build the temple. And Solomon does build the temple, and it is grand, and it is awesome and magnificent. But God cannot be contained in this building made by human hands either, right? Solomon acknowledges that when it is being dedicated, that this is like barely a footstool, that God cannot be contained in this building. It's incomplete. But one of David's descendants could house God. Remember when we talked about this summer that Jesus is the walking, talking, healing, hearing, listening temple? That Jesus is the temple with legs, going out and doing temple things. The Spirit of God that rested in the temple rests in Jesus. And we don't understand the mystery of it, but from the earliest days, the church has declared that Jesus is fully God and fully human. That Jesus, the son of David, the descendant of David, becomes a dwelling place for God. Right? That is the ultimate fulfillment of this part of the promise. And Jesus goes on to release the Spirit of God that is living in him and puts it at Pentecost into the disciples and into the church. And Paul says that the church, that this is my temple. Now we are the dwelling place for God. David saw that God was in a tent, And David wanted something better for the Ark of the Covenant. And Solomon built the temple, and then Jesus, who is the descendant of David, becomes king and the embodied temple. And Jesus again releases the Spirit into the world because God cannot be contained in one location on earth. And so the promise of God made here in 2 Samuel 7, 3,000 years ago, right? This was a promise made 3,000 years ago. It has consequences, and it has been fulfilled and is being fulfilled today in this place because God's Spirit is here with us. We are connected to this story and the promise that God made way back then. God is faithful. God walks with us through all of life, through our brilliant ideas and our accomplishments and our projects, and also through ideas that we have that God closes the door, and ideas that we have that might not be exactly the way God wants to see things done. But God walks with us through that journey. And each one of us is one part of this larger tapestry, this larger story of God working to bring about this message of salvation and reconnection with God to the world. This is just so awesome. This is one of the reasons why I have really enjoyed teaching through this extended series that we're doing, because we get to see how these events that happened in the Bible long, long ago are fulfilled in Jesus, and then we carry that message on through today. These promises of God are thousands of years old, and God continues to keep his promise to us, to them. That's just so amazing. There are so many ways that God shows up in our lives, that God has been consistent through history and through time, and this is one of those. So if you would like to learn more about what is coming next in the story, how this people under King David become transformed and get to Jesus and get to today, follow along. Subscribe to this podcast. Give a like. You can also check out our website, again, scienceridgechurch.org, or follow us on Facebook. And of course, you are always invited to join us on a Sunday morning. We worship on the north side of Sterling on Science Ridge Road at 10 a.m. You're welcome to join us anytime. We'd love to see you here.